This is poliomyelitis, or more commonly known as polio. It is a contagious disease that can affect a child's nerves, brain, and spinal cord. The virus is crippling and potentially deadly if it decimated to the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. Polio is transmitted through the stool of an infected person. Once it is introduced into the mouth of another person through contaminated food or water, polio is untreatable. Depending on the case, a person could be infected with polio for 3 days if it is minor, or have effects lasting a lifetime. Some patients, even after ridding their body of polio, have symptoms that resurface decades later in a disease called post-polio syndrome. This brought back the horrors of their childhood. The potential and spreading ability that polio has makes it an extremely threatening disease. In 1952 alone, the U.S. reported 57,628 cases of polio. This led to more than 20,000 paralyzations and 3,000 deaths. The first clinical description of polio was provided in 1789 by British physician Michael Underwood. In 1894, the first outbreak of polio occurred in the United States in Vermont, with 132 cases. It continued to spread across the U.S., and by 1916, a large epidemic occurred. The epidemic never truly ended until 1961, and by then hundreds of thousands of children had been affected. The peak of this epidemic was in 1952, when polio became a nationwide crisis and a threat to the children of the United States. The terrifying effects of poliomyelitis once struck millions of families across the United States with horror. However, after many years of encountering struggles, a preventative vaccine was finally developed. The peak of this treacherous polio epidemic dragged from 1949 to 1952. It spread from coast to coast and infected many towns, cities, and states. In 1952 alone, there was a recorded 57,628 cases of polio in the United States, with over 3,000 deaths. The main victims of polio were children, since they had weaker immune systems. Their symptoms could last well past childhood, which could make it difficult for patients to walk or breathe, depending on how severe and lasting the effects of polio were on the person. One of the most famous people who contracted polio was Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States President from 1933 to 1945. He started the organization, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, to raise money and spread awareness for the virus. His impactful voice encouraged many people to donate to the young children of the United States who were affected by polio. One machine that some of the money raised would go to was the iron lung. It was used for patients whose polio had traveled to their lungs and needed help breathing. Invented by Philip Dinker and Lewis Shaw Jr., the iron lung works by using positive pressure ventilators to blow air into the patient's lungs. It saved many lives, but they were extremely expensive. Reporter Drew Pearson did a segment on his newscast where he conducted a broadcast while in an iron lung to increase awareness.
Reporting from inside an iron lung. Now, with the help of these young ladies, I'm going to go inside this iron lung. I confess that, how to describe this, you have to synchronize your breathing. Remember that sound. It's a strange sound, but it's breath of a new life to thousands of people.
Parents around the nation were struck with fear from the possibility of their children contracting polio. The alarming number of cases that ended in paralyzation or even death scared parents from east to west. Hundreds of children were paralyzed and even killed due to polio. Polio is a disease with no cure. The catastrophic and deadly illness was a danger to all of the children of the U.S. A way to prevent this horror needed to be identified, for it was the children of America who would suffer if polio was still a threat.
If the fear of contracting polio wasn't enough, there wasn't a vaccine available to the public until 1955. This is when Dr. Jonas Salk came out with a dead poliovirus cell injectable vaccine. Jonas Salk was born on October 28, 1914 in New York City. His parents were Russian Jewish immigrants, and he was the eldest of 3 sons. After earning his medical degree from the New York University of Medicine, working as a scientist-physician at Mount Sinai Hospital, and working at the University of Michigan on a research fellowship for developing influenza vaccines, In 1947, Dr. Jonas Salk got a job at the Virus Research Laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. There, he began to work on techniques that would later help him develop the polio vaccine. While Salk was working on his vaccine, President Franklin D. Roosevelt founded a nonprofit organization called the March of Dimes to help raise money for the researching of polio. In 1945 alone, March of Dimes raised $18.9 million for the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. Meanwhile, Salk was creating his vaccine by killing poliovirus cells with formaldehyde. In his earlier experiments, he injected monkeys with a dead cell vaccine and saw that the vaccine protected the monkeys from paralytic polio. After more finalizing research, on March 26, 1953, Jonas Salk announced that he had created a successful polio vaccine.
An historic victory over a dread disease is dramatically unfolded at the University of Michigan. Here, scientists usher in a new medical age with the monumental reports that prove the Salk vaccine against crippling polio to be a sensational success. It's a day of triumph for 40-year-old Dr. Jonas E. Salk, developer of the vaccine. He arrives with Basil O'Connor, head of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which financed the tests. Hundreds of reporters and scientists from all over the nation gather for the momentous announcement. Proudly on hand, too, are Mrs. Salk and the son, who received the first injections. Chief Evaluator Dr. Thomas Francis pronounces the vaccine tests up to 90% effective, and modest Dr. Salk answers newsmen's questions.
The great wealth of events that is accumulated in the experiences of so many is well represented in the report made this morning. While the contribution of some may seem greater than that of others in one way or another, this gigantic experiment is symbolic of the equally great foundations, both scientific and philanthropic, without which it could not have been conceived or executed.
And the entire world heralded the discovery which assured an end to one of mankind's most dread diseases.
However, it wasn't until after a final experiment in 1954 when Jonas Salk injected that vaccine into 600,000 children with polio and saw that the results were successful, that his vaccine came available to the public. When the vaccine was released on April 12, 1955, polio numbers dropped instantly. The numbers went down 98.8% from 1952 to 1961. As time went on, the U.S. polio cases continued to lower and eradicated by 1979. After a few years of Salk's injectable vaccine being available to the public, the vaccine was later evolved. Dr. Albert Sabin created a more functional oral vaccine that was easier to administer than Salk's. This vaccine, unlike Salk's, used live polio cells. However, this vaccine was not always effective for preventing polio and wasn't very popular in the United States. This is because by the time the oral vaccine was released, Salk's vaccine was already mass-produced in the United States. After Sabin's vaccine was released in 1961, he quickly learned that the United States was not interested in his vaccine. So, Sabin tested his cure in many European countries and didn't end up getting his cure into the U.S. until 1963. The terrifying effects of poliomyelitis once struck millions of families across the United States with horror. However, after many years of encountering struggles, a preventive vaccine was finally developed. This vaccine has saved many children from the effects of polio, even to this day. The same vaccines that Dr. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin created are still used worldwide after they have passed. Both doctors have won many awards for their honorable efforts of preventing polio. Without their vaccines, we would have never been able to fight polio. Their heroic actions will be remembered for decades to come because of the impact they had on everyone in the United States and the rest of the world.